Hello, everyone, and welcome to HCD's office hours for ESG and ESGCB. My name is Marian Goldburn, and I will be your moderator for today's office hour. We're going to hold just a minute for more of our colleagues to join us for today's session. In the meantime, I want to invite y'all to introduce yourselves in the chat box with your name and the region you represent. We will begin soon. Okay, I think we're ready to get started. Again, welcome to this week's office hour for ESG and ESGCB. My name is Marian Goldburn, and I am today's moderator. If you're just joining us, please go to the chat and introduce yourself with your name and the region you represent. As a reminder, this office hour session is being recorded for public record. Office hour recordings are on the HCD ESG webpage under Technical Assistance and Training. A copy of the slide deck and recording will also be emailed to you by your grant administrator or annual representative. Next slide, please. If you need to ask a question, this is the format. All questions can be submitted in the chat box. Please type your organization and question in the chat box. The team will read questions out loud at the end of the presentation and will provide answers if possible throughout the presentation. All questions and answers entered in the chat box will be recorded as part of public record. Alongside our presenters, we have several HCD staff, including ESG representatives, ESGCB grant administrators, and other consultants who are able to answer questions during the Q&A session. Next slide, please. Today's agenda include announcements, ESG and ESGCB updates, office hours updates, ESG and ESGCB Q&A, and our brown bag session on engagement with DV providers. Next slide, please. I would also like to inform you of an upcoming training on this Friday, April 1st on habitability standards. It will begin at 10 a.m. Pacific time through 12 p.m. All subgrantees, subrecipient partners, and COC staff should attend. We will post the registration link in our chat today. This session will provide an overview of ESG habitability requirements and clarify any key differences between habitability standards and HQS. It will also provide examples of habitability record-keeping requirements, including any clarification between the differences between habitability, environmental, and lead-based paint review. We'll also include time for Q&A between the participants and the presenters. So be sure to review information about this and any other upcoming trainings at the California ESGCB training schedule, which we will also post this link in our chat. Next slide, please. This is a special announcement about the office hour calendar invite. Please note that the current office hour Zoom invite that was set to expire in May will now go through September 30th. All the current office hour registrants should have received an email from Zoom yesterday with an updated calendar schedule. You will need to download the new invite from the email that was sent in order to get the office hours meeting on your calendar through September 30th. You can always re-register as well in case the option that I listed above does not work for you. And we will again post the office hour registration link in our chat, and it will also be in the invites that are sent out. Next slide, please. So now we'll go over some ESG updates. Please note that the 2022 ESG NOFA applications are set to release at the end of May. The 2021 ESG applications award announcements will take place between March and April of 2022, and it will be posted on the ESG webpage. For the 2020 ESG annual contracts, as a reminder, the expenditure deadline is July 7th, 2022. So be sure you are expending all your ESG annual funds, and you can also utilize the COVID waivers. Next slide, please. COVID waivers with the 2020, 2029, and 2018 ESG annual funds. As a recipient, HUD does require the state to track any annual ESG funds that's used to prepare for, prevent, or respond to COVID-19 separately than annual ESG funds not used for COVID-19 response. Emails were sent out to all ESG grantees that had a 2018, 2019, and 2020 ESG annual contract. Be sure to complete a spreadsheet and the COVID waiver template, if this is applicable, and return it to your ESG representative. If you have not received this request, please be sure to reach out to your ESG representative. We will extend the due date for these to return by Friday, April 1st, close of business. Next slide, please. And this slide has the ESG team members listed here. And so we have realigned our grant management territories, and you may have a new ESG rep. In case you need to reach out to your rep, you can contact them at esgnofa@hcd.ca.gov. Next slide, please. And now for a few ESG CV reminders and updates. Please continue to work towards submitting your February RFF and your budget amendments for cleaning up any indirect costs in eCivis if you have not yet submitted these. Next slide, please. Also, we will post the link where you will be able to access the training site. And our upcoming office hour trainings include on April 6th, a training on the equal access rule, tool, and planning for LGBTQ+ inclusion. On April 13th, we will have the authentic engagement of persons with lived experience. And April 20th, we will present on the language access plan and duplication of benefits. And on April 27th, we will present on engagement with tribal nations. Next slide, please. So this next slide includes some COVID response resources. You can take note of those. And the next slide also include ESG resource links. So please take note of these, and they will also be in the slides which will be sent out. Next slide, please. Again, if you have any questions, be sure to post those in the chat, and we will answer as we go along in our presentation. Next slide, please. If you have any further questions, be sure to contact your annual rep. Again, they can be reached at esg@hcd.ca.gov. And for ESG CV questions, you may reach out to your grant administrator. Next slide, please. And now I will turn it over to Chris for today's presentation.
Thank you, Marian. And thank you all for joining us this morning, this afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. I am Chris Pitcher. I am the Training and Technical Assistance Lead for the ESG CV contract with California HCD. We are going to have our brown bag session today on working with victim service providers, whether that's working within the team of care context or within the coordinated entry system context or within a lot of different contexts. So I am pleased to have with me from Homebase, Karen Cowell, who's going to walk us through a short presentation. We also have a very special guest for our question, answer, and discussion portion of today's event. Andrea Curry from Empower Tehama will also be with us to help us really round out this conversation. We know that victim service providers and how they have to operate under the Violence Against Women Act, or known as VAWA, make coordination a little bit more tricky. So we just need to be open about that trickiness and be ready to have some conversation on how to make that work, because there isn't a choice of whether we need to coordinate. It's just how do we do it best, really. So I'll hand it to Karen, who will walk us through a short presentation. Karen, fire away.
Hey, thanks, Chris. Appreciate it. We can go on to the next slide. So we hope to be able to answer these 3 questions today. What is a victim service provider? Why it's important to include domestic violence service providers in your homeless system of care? What are some of the benefits, and connecting folks to housing resources, connecting survivors especially. You can go on to the next one. So I just wanted to start really quickly with just some definitions. Many of you may already be aware of these definitions. I just like to make sure we're on the same page, and then when you have the slides later, you can refer back to some of these. So with what is a victim service provider, this is part of HUD's definitions and their definition. The main focus is on this primary mission. So the primary mission of the organization is serving victims of domestic violence. I think the important thing to note here is there are many, many agencies that provide domestic violence services that are not victim service providers under HUD's definition. And so it's important to not just include those of the primary mission, but also to include those who do that work on a regular basis. You can go to the next slide. So just reminder again, survivors are part of the homeless definition. It might be a category we've forgotten about over time, but they are part of the homeless definition. So they are considered homeless because they are fleeing or attempted to flee domestic violence. So go on to the next slide, please. Just wanted to go a little deeper. Sometimes we're not all super interested in reading the regulation itself or all the details of the homeless definition, but so these are the details of that definition. I think important things to recognize under category 4 is it's, a little bit more than just fleeing, right? We have really more context about what's included here. We have this idea that you're unable to return to the residence that you had because of the violence or stalking or whatever that's occurring at that residence. You have no other place to go and have that place be your residence, right? You may have some place to go for a night or a couple nights, but you can't reside there, and that you lack the resources that to obtain permanent housing. So again, you don't have enough money, you don't have enough support network, you don't have enough other things in order to be to get to permanent housing. So again, like survivors are homeless because the violence in their residence and they lack the means to obtain permanent housing. I always like to point out that HUD has clarified that human trafficking is included under category 4. So often this is a very typical question of whether someone who's fleeing a trafficking situation is considered homeless. And so the answer to that is yes. There's a broad clause of other dangerous, life-threatening conditions. And so trafficking is part of that. So then by that, trafficking organizations are part of the group that we should be working with as well. Next slide, please. So now that we're all clear, survivors are part of the homeless definition. I think it's important to think about what the continuum of care does and what their mandate is. So it's part of the mandate of the continuum of care, the COC, is to address the needs of all homeless people in their geography. So that definition includes lots of subpopulations, and survivors are one of those subpopulations. I put this little phrase in the bottom. So why does it feel so hard if they're already part of the homeless definition? Well, there's lots and lots of different reasons. But one of the reasons that I wanted to focus on is that I think, and in my experience doing this work for a long time, is that whenever we interact with another sector, and in many levels, domestic violence is a different sector, like public housing or healthcare or veterans or people living with AIDS. Like these sectors, they feel really similar to the homeless system. They sound like the homeless system. They have their own resources that address the issue, but none of those can fully address it on their own. Like the homeless system, we can't fully address it. But we always have kind of like stumbling, and it always feels hard to work with a new sector. And one of the ways that we really can do that is if we start by understanding each other and how we can interact, because we don't always understand each other, and we interact in the most productive way. So sometimes we just do things with that sector when someone else forces us to, or someone says something that brings them in. So when we're working with other sectors, it is like a relationship, right? And we find that the most successful of these relationships, or when these systems work best together, is that when we understand and educate each other about what we're doing and how we do things. So what does this mean? I mean, I think the 0 point for me, or the starting point, is always, are we speaking the same language? So we often use similar terms, but sometimes those terms mean different things. And it can be really simple things like the term homeless, right? There are many DV providers who don't believe their clients are homeless, right? Because they don't like that kind of term placed on their client, even though by definition we say they are. The same way we know lots of people who are experiencing homelessness in our homeless system who don't want to consider them homeless as well. There's a lot of acronyms, right? We use a ton of acronyms in the homeless system. Some of us have pages of acronyms we share with people when they come into the system, and so does the DV system, but the DV system doesn't know our acronyms. We don't know theirs. We throw them around like everybody knows them. The other thing we always need to understand is, what are the strengths and what motivates someone to end someone's homeless experience? So we need to really understand those things in order to work better together, because what we think motivates the DV system may not be the same thing as what motivates us as homeless service providers. So there's different examples of this. I just picked out one. It's on the next slide. It's just a baseline one. I think like when we're trying to understand each other with terms and like what's important to us, I think I always go to how we measure success, right? And so in this work, like when we think about how someone is successful, we think about what's in that circle. So what's their housing situation? Do they have housing that's sufficient for them? Do they have income? Do they have income that improves their quality of life? Do they have income that they could maintain their housing without any assistance, things like that? We look at people's health, like we want to know that someone's health is improving, their physical health, their mental health, things like that. And then we look at often community, like are they integrated into the community? Have they developed new or repaired social connections to have a support network, things like that. And so those are some of like the core things of like success, right? And so in the homeless system, and like I'm using homeless versus domestic violence to distinguish the sectors, not to say survivors aren't homeless, because we just said they were. So in the homeless sector, we look at housing, income, health, and community, and we think about stability, right? So our measure of the success is someone stably housed, and can they maintain that stable housing? Whereas in contrast with the domestic violence sector, their lens or their term is really about safety, right? So when they think of housing, is that housing safe for them? Is it a location where they can remain safe? For income, do they have income to be self-sufficient and to be independent? Has their mental health improved because of this new housing, this new safety plan that they have? And in the community, are they safe? Do they have the supports needed to maintain their safety and to be successful? So I think for me, this is an example that is really highlights that we say we mean many of the similar things, but we call it something different. I'm going to the next slide. So this helps with our understanding. So I probably should have titled this benefits and common ground. So these are all ways we can work with and incorporate domestic violence providers into our COC, how they can strengthen your COC, how they can add to the available resources. And these are just some of the ways. These are just like some of the ways that come to mind when I think about this. I am going to just say, like, not all DV providers are great at all of these things, just like not all homeless providers are super awesome at these things. I'm bringing these up as areas of commonality and things that I see that these two areas are interconnected and how we can really benefit, have some mutual benefits with each other. I never mention anything without housing first. I mean, it's the ground, and the ground, it's all of our work is grounded in housing first, low barriers to entry. Again, survivors, DV providers are like the homeless system, working with people and having no barriers. There's no income barrier. There's no barrier about like having the right story to get in and things like that. Some providers, DV providers, even work with the abuser if that's what the survivor wants. So there's really is a grounding in housing first and those principles. Tied to that very, very closely is the equal access rule. I think that many DV providers have been sheltering and housing people regardless of family composition, regardless of gender identity, regardless of the age of male children for a long time. I mean, I think the interesting thing for me is when talking with DV providers and talking about these particular things, they're like, well, that wasn't a big deal. We just did it. And it didn't feel hard to us. I think in the homeless sector, we still hear and people still feel that some of the equal access things with gender and the age of children and the family composition is still hard. And so there is a learning to do from them, because that grounding and safety and not re-traumatizing people has had them accept people for who they are and where they're at, and not making things difficult because of that orientation. So some communities use their DV providers as a resource to help implement some of these, some of the things with equal access, because they do have experience with it. I think the biggest one for me is trauma-informed care. It probably could have been the biggest box on the slide, but I would say that DV providers have been practicing trauma-informed care before it turned into something that we're all trying to do or implement, before it became this buzzword that everyone should do, right? So utilize them as a resource for this, and lots of communities do this. So really, if you look closely and get to know your DV service providers, you will learn that their services and operations are grounded in trauma-informed care. They're grounded in not re-traumatizing people by having interactions with their abuser, or having the wrong people come into the shelter. So all of their protocols are around this safety piece for shelter and disclosing information and keeping people safe, including their data. You also see the trauma-informed orientation with planning and preparing clients or participants for what may or may not happen. This could be like preparing them for a court appearance or preparing them to move into units. So really talking through them about what to expect, what can happen, what kind of things can they expect. So you're trying to minimize the trauma that might occur for them in there, so they're prepared for what's next. Honestly, the reality of the work that we do is that many, many people who experience homelessness have experienced trauma because of violence or abuse at some point in their life. It's just that they don't talk to us about it the same way they would talk to a DV provider about it. So one of the core questions of our work is, how do you minimize re-traumatizing someone when you're working with them? And I think most DV providers are very experienced and can help COCs be better at having a trauma-informed programs and a trauma-informed system. And some DV providers are the trauma-informed care trainer in their communities. I kind of hit on this with trauma-informed care with disclosure. I think like one of the things that DV providers, they are, in the nature of the work, used to hearing and assisting with difficult situations and traumatic events when participants bring them up. And I think often in the shelter and housing projects, For us, that can take a while because the trust has to happen before someone's willing to disclose difficult things. And so often when it happens, it surprises us. We're not really prepared for it. And we're not expecting it. And so we feel ill-equipped to handle those types of situations. So I think this is another way of talking about disclosure and reacting and working through when clients disclose traumatic events. Is something that DV providers can really help with training and sharing best practices with other people in your community. I just want to talk a little bit about choice. Of course, choice is when we're out finding housing and ensuring participants feel safe in that housing location across the board. I think, I also like to keep in mind the DV providers, they also have to support participants when they're making choices they don't agree with, like returning to their abuser. So in some ways, this is similar to how we feel when someone chooses to go back to the street or some other unsafe situation. Like, we have to honor someone's choice to do that, but we also want to prepare them and support them for what's going to happen when they're, going through that situation or making those choices. So we can support each other with processing those types of situations. I think also with regard to client choice, I think because of the kind of the two systems and resources in each, we see that survivors present for housing resources through our regular coordinated entry system. Some of those do that because they know where the resources are, but sometimes DV providers talk with them about whether going through CES is a way for them to get access to permanent housing more quickly, but preparing them for what that choice means, right? That they'll be sharing their personal information, there'll be some visibility in HMIS, maybe with other providers. And so what that means, so in the end, that clients are able to make educated choices. So, right, we want to always be educating people on their choices. Elevating survivor needs, I think, having DV providers at the COC table, especially at like the board level, will elevate the needs of survivors and keep them in the forefront of people's minds for planning. Getting that data from them in order to do planning is important. Also, when we talk about resources needs like housing and shelter, we want to ensure that everyone, including survivors, have a safe place to stay. In my experience, DV providers often have much better data about their unmet need than the homeless system does. So there's more tracking of like, how many people did we turn away on this particular night, and more details about that. So that can help with some of the work we do with unmet need. Including improving participant outcomes. I think in this having DV providers there, you have this whole other system of resources that's available, and like they're interested in improving the outcomes for their people and improving referral processes, ensuring that participants are getting the right services. So we all want our people to get the right services, and the best way to ensure that good coordination and better outcomes is by working together. So then the needs to refer someone in the homeless system to a DV provider because they disclose something that's traumatic and shows that they've had some domestic violence in their past. Like, we would want to make that referral to help that person become more stable and healthier in their lives, right? And addressing that trauma. But we also want, so we want people to know how to access those services. I think on the other side, like employment is a great example, right? The vast majority of survivors, depending on where you are and your program, 70-80% or higher have zero income. They have no financial resources whatsoever. So connecting survivors to employment resources and employment programs is really important for that idea of being safe and stable. I think, and the last one is resource utilization. I think I've said this already, but no one has enough resources, right? So it's important to make sure we all utilize what we have. So we see this in different ways. So in some ways that programs work together is that they're serving the same clients. So we may see that your DV provider has rental assistance dollars, but they don't have enough service dollars to help somebody. But your CalWorks program might have enough service dollars, but not enough rental assistance. So by kind of bringing those two folks together, we can really maximize the resources and make sure people have the help and support that they need. So these are just some of the ideas of how to benefit, and having your DV providers at the table can really help move these things forward, because you're talking to each other and you're working together. Next slide. So I think some of the tips or best practices for this kind of engagement is, I would just say, don't call your DV provider once a year when you need data for your COC application, and then they never hear from you again. No one likes that kind of relationship where someone just calls you when they need something. So, these relations take time, and people, we want to feel included. So make sure you're including them throughout a variety of different things. This can also include, if you're the lead of your continuum and you have new permanent housing projects coming on with a DV provider, are you giving them the support that they need to be successful? Are you treating your comparable database administrator the same as you would as someone who administers HMIS in your community? Are you including them in trainings and informing them of changes? Do they know the right terms and what those terms mean? So how can you engage them in more meaningful ways? So leveraging each other's strengths. The other slide, we really talked about how to leverage each other's strengths, but what are the DV providers in your community really good at, and how can you work with them? But also, how can you help them learn more about their systems, about your system as well? So I think that trauma-informed care, they're a great resource to make either your programs or your system more trauma-informed, and you can help them with some of the housing and the nuts and bolts of doing permanent housing programs. Again, learning from each other, all these things about learning. DV providers want to know about the COC and what you're doing, so how it works, what resources are available. So don't assume, and you want to know from them what's available in your resources, what isn't available in your sector. So don't assume one training one time will cover everything you need and what you need to learn from each other. And then the other theme for today is kind of don't be afraid, right? It feels scary to work with each other because we don't fully understand each other and what we're doing. So it's worth the work, and I recommend that you all don't be afraid and just press on to go through some of the challenges that are there. Next slide, please. So we would be remiss if we didn't talk about coordinated entry when we're talking about working with DV providers. There is tension. We should just acknowledge there's tension, but why does this tension exist? I just wanted to put this up for you to think about, is there tension because there's scarcity of resources, right? Neither the DV sector or the homeless sector have enough resources. Sometimes we look at each other and we're like, well, they have resources over there, let's go there. And so not having enough resources creates tension. Different definitions of vulnerability, right? How a DV provider might define a family that's vulnerable and fleeing DV may be different than how the homeless system is defining what a similar family who's not fleeing DV and their vulnerability. So this creates tension because there's lots of definitions of vulnerability, and it feels like sometimes we're supposed to just have one, right? And that is probably not the case. And then sharing information, and this is really personal information, sharing data that provides tension for us as well. So these are all the challenges we have. So we do have to create a coordinated entry system together. I mean, if you are creating something and your DV provider isn't at the table, I would question the strength of that system because you don't have their input. It'd be like creating your CES system without your veterans providers there, right? We want to make sure everyone's at the table. There's lots of different ways to do coordinated entry. From HUD's perspective, you don't have to have separate systems, but you need to build something that works for your community. So I just put a couple of slides together of different structures that may work for coordinated entry. So next slide, please. So the first one is probably the most utilized, or the one that we go through intuitively when we think that, and this is a parallel system, right? So parallel systems are when CES for domestic violence is separate from CES for the general homeless population. And those two systems don't generally interact very much with each other. They're, for the data collection piece, data is collected in separate locations. Some communities may use the exact same database to collect data for HMIS, for DV and the homeless system, excuse me. Some may not, right? But you could structure it so everything is the same, so it's easy to compare things. Generally, we see by name lists having 2 by name lists, so one just for survivors, and then the homeless by name list, which might be segmented in various ways. We see that access points and assessors may also be separate so that we can move people to the correct place in order to get assessed. You know, our DV CE assessors are generally trained, you know, have that 40 or however many hour training is needed to work with people experiencing domestic violence. If someone presents in the wrong place, we probably are moving them to the other place so that they can get assessed by the right people. You know, it may happen that people are on both lists because they've chosen to present themselves at both lists because they know there's resources. A survivor may go because they know there's homeless resources, they might access them faster, or we may recommend that, you know, someone we know is fleeing domestic violence go to the DV coordinate entry. So some people may be in both places. This is the last point is like the 2.0 point for me of once you have these 2 parallel systems, there's a point in time where we want to make sure that people who are on the homeless by name list could get resources in the DV if they're fleeing domestic violence, and vice versa. We want some folks who are on the domestic violence CE list to have access to homeless resources. So this is managed like through the CES lead or your list manager. So in order to keep the integrity of those parallel systems, processes and workflows are developed that come through the CES lead to maintain some of the needs for protecting personal information and things like that. So often with parallel systems, like sometimes if there's only one provider, you just naturally have a parallel system because they're doing their own thing and doing their own parts of CES for the DV community. You know, if you have multiple DV providers in a geography, it can become more complicated with some of the restrictions on where data can be entered or how data can be entered by victim service providers. Next slide, please. So, I mean, the last part is like an integrated system. So this is a system where you kind of have one system that everyone is using regardless if they're homeless or they're survivors, right? With this system, there's a lot of process and community understanding that needs to take place. So this is a system where everybody is functioning in a trauma-informed way. Everybody understands what safety is and why we need to keep people safe. This is a place where you have processes to get the information from survivors from a VSP into your data that usually comes through a CES lead or a list manager. You don't necessarily have multiple database or multiple lists. So the list CES lead or list manager is managing a lot of those things. Access points, again, this is this idea of, so you may have one list, and so the list manager knows, you know, you have people on that list who are identified by a unique identifier that the victim service provider has created. So everyone's on the same list, but you don't necessarily know everyone's name, right? And so some places it's hard. They don't like that type of matching or referral if they don't know people's names before they get them. So access points and assessors are trained to work with survivors, right? So this idea that everyone's all trauma informed, they're all understanding why survivors need special things. They have some training on how that works. So you have policies and procedures in place to protect safety and PII. So again, your VSP is not entering the data into that database. So generally what happens is like they create a unique identifier and they would send a list of those unique identifiers with the minimal data needed for matching to the CES lead to have them incorporated on the list. So that could be the unique identifier that was created, the agency that created it, the score, whatever tool you're using, probably something about how big their family is. and things like that. So, so again, there's lots of protocols to keep people safe and processes to keep the integrity of survivor safety and their personal information. An integrated system, everyone has access to the same resources, regardless if they're homeless or survivors. So that list, instead of having like, all the resources are together, like if there's specialization for eligibility, we know what those are, and we place people based on that, of course, but like there's not a lot of things that are separate. So I think I have one more slide, if you can move on to that one. We'll say both complicated. I'm not saying one or the other of these is easy, but it's work, right? Because of a lot of the constraints that are in place in the system. So I'm sure some of you listened to what I just said, and like if you're an HMIS person, your hair might have been set on fire because like you don't like hearing things like unique identifier or de-identified information or anonymous records, because those are kind of things that make you worry about your HMI system. Like you can have those things in your system and you can still have data quality, right? When we say those words, then so HMIS leads might be like, well, what about these unknown things? A lot of unknown things in my data quality, that's not good. And so sometimes it's like educating the community and like making sure that it's not like a lot of unknown data in your system, but that the data is actually refused or they didn't disclose and they're marking the right things. And so there's ways to feel good about having these things in your system and still adhering to a high level, a level of data quality that you can live with. You have to be okay with having some duplication, right? So I'm not saying, do not leave and say, Karen said, let's have a closed system of HMIS again. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying I would not advocate for that. And I've done a lot of work with people who don't want their records shared. So, we need to, like with choice, and we need to protect people's information when they want to, and it needs to be protected. That's part of our role too, right? And so, we need to do that, and we need to have the processes and policies and procedures in place, so, back in the day when, HMIS was really gathering ground, like when I was on the HMIS committee, one of the providers was our DV provider, and they were the advocate to like really force us to work through the hard questions of sharing data and how to keep people safe and how to do all those things. And so it's a real advantage to have those people at the table. The next two are just reminders. VSPs must use a comparable database if they get HUD funding. So there's that. VSPs cannot enter PII into HMIS. I know we all hope there's some way around that really hard rule about that, but of all the HUD things that are concrete, like I know we get frustrated because there's a lot of gray in the HUD world, this is not one of them. So your VSPs cannot enter PII into HMIS. That doesn't mean you can't they can't do it. So I just want to leave it at that. And then ROI should be your new best friend, right? So like when you work with victim service providers or DV providers or even HIV providers or providers who are really intimately concerned about safety and sharing information, like a release of information is where you get to share information. And sometimes you just have to be okay with doing more than one release of information or redoing a release of information because something changes, or they did one for CES, but now they're into housing. And so they have to work with somebody else. And so, don't be afraid of an ROI. Don't be afraid to do it more than once. This can really help you with some of the like data things that feel hard. And I think that's all that I've got.
Thanks, Karen. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide. Yes, we are to our discussion point. So just remember, we have about 15 minutes. This is time for you to come off mute if you wish. Raise your hand. We can unmute you if you'd rather. Put it in the chat. I do have a few things that I want to say that I want to ask Andrea Curry to react. And then Luis also had some comments in the chat that I'd like to pull out for a moment. So I think my big takeaway from talking about victim service providers and the Violence Against Women Act and DV coordinated entry is the fact that not all victims of domestic violence are going to be served by a victim service provider. And not all those being served by a victim service provider are going to need permanent housing through non-DV services, but many are. So there's a natural connection here. We know that there are victims of domestic violence in our shelters that aren't DV shelters. We know they're in our permanent housing programs. We also know that not everyone that is being served by a victim service provider needs permanent housing, but many will. And how do they access that if it's not DV specific? So there are a lot of places these systems need to kind of coordinate and come together that lead to having a session like this with Karen. So Karen, I want to just thank you with that. That's kind of what stuck with me. And I will turn it over to our friends at Empower Tehama, Andrea Curry. Andrea, any quick reactions to what you heard from Karen, or anything you'd like to kind of share from your experience as a victim service provider?
Yeah, sure. Really quick though, thank you, Karen. That was really comprehensive and great, and I really appreciated all the information in there. The one thing that I personally, just a little background, I am the system administrator for our community-wide HMIS. I am also with our victim services agency, and I'm the system administrator for the HMIS comparable database. So the one thing that I would really stress that Karen did touch on, but that I feel is like super incredibly important, if you want good data from your VSPs, include them in include them in all of the guidance and all of the training and all of the decision making around your regular HMIS. It may be true that they cannot actually enter information in there, but the things that your HMIS users learn through those trainings, help them get onto those the mailing lists for all the guidance that goes out to HMIS administrators, because that really sets them up to collect good data, to be able to report, accurately. So if you think about it, anyone who is the system admin for an HMIS comparable database is an HMIS administrator, period. They're running, maybe it's only one organization entering into that database, but they need to understand how to collect those elements, what the questions mean, and how to clean up their data, how to look at those reports and say, this number doesn't look right, and let me figure out why. I think sometimes there's a kind of a barrier you run into where you're like, well, why am I going to invite them to learn how to enter HMIS into our system when they're using a different one? But if you really pay attention to what you're training in HMIS trainings for your users, yes, there's some of it that's about like, here, click this screen, go here and put this in. But a lot of it, you're teaching them what these elements are and what they're being collected for and how they're used. So I think that would be my one biggest thing that I would like to stress. I think the other one would really be understand the capacity of your victim service providers. That's going to be different in different areas. As Karen kind of touched on, there are some resources that DV providers may have access to that the larger field for addressing homelessness doesn't have access to. But understand that those resources also have to pay for a whole slew, a big menu of other services that they're providing to survivors, and not necessarily just survivors experiencing homelessness. So, you may be able to, say, well, you guys are getting all this money from, whatever source, but understand what all that has to pay for and what's left over to pay for, to support their housing services. So understanding their capacity. I know we all have safe transfer plans. We, if we're doing it right, we've got connections with our VSPs and we know how to get folks who disclose to us over there, but we have to be really careful about people falling through the cracks. If someone discloses and gets diverted over to the victim service provider, but they don't have the capacity to serve them, then that person kind of sits in this like in between space of like, okay, well, the regular shelter wants me over here, but the DV shelter is saying they don't have room for me. So you want to make sure that you have plans for those contingencies. Like if the DV shelter is full, how do we make sure that this person gets served in a safe manner? Yeah, so I think those were the only things I wanted to like highlight there, but I'm totally willing to answer any questions if anybody has any.
Thanks, Andrea. We don't have any questions yet, but I do appreciate that. Karen, any reaction to Andrea? Because I have a reaction that's going to lead me into my next comment. So just wanted to give you the floor for a moment.
No, Andrea is amazing. I didn't want to steal her fire for those 2 points because I felt like those might be things she wanted to like highlight. I think she's like 100% right with the HMIS, especially. Like I think Andrea kind of blew my mind because I think most communities aren't including their VSPs with a comparable database in that way. And it's so important that we all understand the terms because those terms are very specific to the HUD world, right? And then the resource thing. I mean, for me, it's like you have to figure out a way to talk to each other if you really want resources to be allocated and to help people in the best possible way. To Andrea's point of like, yes, like we don't have room at the DV shelter, but you have room. So how can we make this work until like there's another slot, or how do we get those services that person needs to them at the shelter? How do we train the shelter staff to be more informed about the needs of a survivor who might be in their shelter? So
yes, thanks, Karen. I'm going to echo the same thing. HMIS and comparable databases feel like there's a big wall between them. We need to break that wall down and be like, this is the same thing. We need to know the same information. It might not be the same data entry process, reporting process, or might not even be the same data system, but it's the same data elements. It's the same privacy. It's the same security. We're have a lot more commonalities than we have differences, and working together is important. Since we're disclosing and kind of blowing Karen's mind today, I'll just turn the clock back to 2003, 2004 when I started my HMIS in an unnamed community. We actually had victim service providers using HMIS because the Violence Against Women Act did not prohibit it specifically until 2005. And we did that because we wanted to coordinate. We knew that victim service providers were most of the time maxed out of capacity, and we might be able to work together. Once the Violence Against Women Act said that wasn't doable, we had to find different ways to do that. And I think we're still finding those connections today. Many, many years after 2005, I don't want to say how many years because it makes me feel old, but those things happened in communities from time to time. So I'm going to take the HMIS point and the coordinated entry points that we made before and ask Louise to come off mute and talk to us. Louise, you had 2 comments. One was about your HMIS configuration being similar to what Andrea has, as having the HMIS folks and the comparable database folks working together. But you also mentioned your anonymity processes that you use for your coordinated entry. So I think both of those topics would be very salient for now. So thank you.
Okay, I'd like to shout out Karen and Andrea again. They great presentation with it. Andrea, I love it. You wear lots of hats too. They're just different hats than mine. So one of the things that we did, so if there are any victim services providers that are on this call, one of the things that we started doing many years ago was we felt that we needed to have a seat at the table with the COC. And I'm suspecting I see Andrea nodding, and that's the way you get your needs across, is by participating. So we've been doing that for well over a decade. And at this point in time, I'm also the COC co-chair for CA 515. And I was part of the group that started the initial coordinated entry system back in 2017. We were at that point a merged COC with Nevada County. And so my Community Beyond Violence counterparts from their agency also helped with creating our system. And I think that's partly what's made it successful within our community, was that we were there from the beginning, and it made it a little easier. It made it easier to educate our counterparts with just general housing assistance on why we had to have things the way we had to have them. So what we've done is we run our comparable database for other database providers. We're on Apricot, which is now owned by Social Solutions, which is the same group that owns ETO, which is the other big one that most of the providers are using in our area. And they are HMIS comparable. They include the same fields for HMIS automatically. So from a data quality standpoint, in theory, it should not be difficult. And what our resolution was we do have people that sit on both. We use the client record number as the person's name. So it doesn't say anonymous, it does tie to a specific person easily. It does require an extra step. So we don't participate directly in HMIS. Our HMIS administrator is the only person who has an HMIS seat. Everybody else is on the apricot seats. And if we need to put somebody in anonymously to the CES, then he gets that data flag from program, and he enters the anonymous information that we need to get them effectively into the COCs by name list. It's helpful because a lot of people do face multiple issues. A survivor can be a veteran. They can have a severe mental health issue. They may have a disability, and all of those have different funding sources that are also available to them as housing resources. So one of the things that I struggle with is sometimes we have people that have a lot of needs, but the instinct is to send them to us first. And sometimes we're maybe not the best first option because the biggest barrier they may be facing may be around another issue with the violence coming in as a secondary problem. So sometimes we are better off being the wraparound care provider than we are being the housing provider. And that's something that we found particularly with the institution of coordinated entry and taking the most vulnerable, because even within a safety setting, sometimes the most vulnerable people have really, really severe mental health problems or really severe substance abuse issues. And we shouldn't be their first stop for housing. So that would be my comment to the people who are on the other side with the general housing, that you're right, we are at capacity. Our shelter is full again. We will do our best to place with sister agencies if we can. And if it's practical, we'll try and alternate with, if it's safe to place them in a hotel motel for a few days while we're making other arrangements. But sometimes the only option is to work with our community providers. And that's always with the survivors okay, because it's always voluntary if they choose to participate within the wider system or not. So does that answer all the questions?
I think it does, Louise. Thank you so much for that. Andrea, Karen, anything to add to what Louise was sharing?
I just wanted to add, yeah, I think I'm right there with you on so much of that. For us in particular, we're in a small county and we do run parallel CES, but you're right, there are some times where it is appropriate and necessary to make sure that survivors have access to those same services that can only be accessed through the more general CES. And we do have a couple ways of doing that because we use 211 as our primary entry point for our regular CES. We do have a description that we can provide survivors and give them the option of making that call. And we always let them know that it's completely up to them whether they want to disclose any information about any of their situations, but we can facilitate that. You can get into this system if you want to, but we also have done before where we will use a unique identifier to get a survivor into that overall system, and our CES includes like kind of a notes field, right, so that the surveyor entering that assessment can actually put in, like to house this client, contact this case manager or contact Empower Tehama, that kind of thing. And then using that unique identifier works great because they call up and they say, I wanted to talk to somebody about this, this client, using that unique identifier. And that's when we can start that ROI process to say, okay, we need to get your consent to talk here. So we have had some success with that.
Yeah, we have as well, and we use that similar model. And likewise, we'll pull our database administrator when we have openings. We'll pull from the HMIS list in case there's anybody who's fleeing who is not already being served, just so that we cover all bases and we make sure that any survivor that is needing safety services has them.
Thank you. That was not something that had come to my mind, but that is so important too. One of the things we have built into our regular CES is just kind of like a form logic so that it'll pop up. If somebody does answer yes, that they're fleeing, a field will pop up instructing the surveyor to ask if they would like to be, connected to Empower Tehama. Now we do, and we try and be really, we try and respect client choice there, because some folks, for whatever reason, maybe they've dealt with us before and decided they don't want to anymore. Maybe they're not ready to accept services there, but we try and make sure that anybody who might, even come close to disclosing there, at least has our hotline number and knows, hey, these folks might be able to help you with some of your other needs, even if you want to continue with this survey into the system.
Yes, and we've provided training to our 211 to try, if they do start disclosing, to hand that off as soon as possible, because the 211 calls are recorded. And I don't know if other people's COC 211s do that. But part of the reason they record is to get an affirmative ROI via verbal, so they can continue with referring services. But on the DV side, that is not protected information, and that recording could be subpoenaed. So we've tried to make sure that we educate the 211 staff on the fact that, hey, once they start disclosing, wanting to talk about it, send them over to our crisis line instead, so that we can get it on a confidential call.
Right.
Yeah, Andrea, you're
Yes.
smiling at that one.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, for sure. And that is something we worked with our 211 even way before we contracted with them for a coordinated entry, you know, and they've been great partners there about getting folks to us and even explaining, you know, about that confidentiality. Hey, let me connect you to somebody that you can speak to confidentially, and who is trained to address these matters. So yeah.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Louise. Karen, thank you for the presentation today. I am very happy that Andrea from Tehama and Louise from Nevada counties were able to share real life on the ground California coordination experience. Karen, anything to say before we depart?
No, it makes me sad that we're already at the hour, because I feel like I wasted everyone's time by talking too much. So
no way.
We'll need a part 2 so people can get more questions answered. But I mean, yeah, Louise and Andrea, you're amazing, and like, thank you for all those real world examples. That's what people really need to hear, that they can make it work, and what are the things that need to happen. So I'm really grateful for your input today.
And thank you for your presentation, Karen. That was awesome. In fact, I'm excited for when the recording here comes out, because I just want to show it to all my VSP people and say, look, we're talking about this in ESG circles.
Awesome.
And it was a great.
Forthcoming. We will get the materials out after this session. I'm sorry, Louise, did you have something to say as a final shot?
Karen, you did not take up too much time. It was a great presentation. So thank you.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Karen. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you to the ESG-CV Grant Administration team for keeping us all here and on tech. We will be back at this next week. Until then, enjoy your week. Talk to you later.